It must be very satisfying to be the father of the marijuana liberation movement, one of the creators of that movement, one of the action figures in that movement. It must be very gratifying to see that movement come to a point of acceptance and reality. But at the same time, it must be enormously galling to find yourself hauled off into jail and see 5 years of your life incarcerated by crazy zealots who put you behind bars just as the rest of society is changing their mind and liberalizing their laws. So I'd like to bring on stage Marc Emery, Jodie Emery. Marc spoke to us before he went to jail. Jodie spoke for him while he was in jail. And now I'm pleased to see both of them here at liberty. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. If you saw me here last year when I was speaking, I was pretty rushed, I was pretty frail, I was pretty distressed because my husband had been in a US federal prison as a political prisoner, strictly for raising millions of dollars through marijuana seed sales to finance legalization, ballot initiatives, court cases, activist groups in the United States and around the world when no one else was doing it. Please research the Prince of Pot. But in my brief moments, I want to tell you about marijuana legalization being an incredibly important issue, not only because of the potential with the jobs that we can create, with the lives we can save, with the suffering we can heal with medical marijuana, but we need to remember that marijuana prohibition has cost us in ways we cannot even calculate. The human cost of prohibition is so enormous, there is no number. So while we talk about let's legalize pot so we can make these green jobs and have hemp and medical marijuana, and I'm sure you're all very aware pot is popular, it's in the news, it's worth billions and trillions of dollars, but we also have prohibition which costs us, you, the taxpayers, trillions of dollars in policing and courts and prisons and arrests and tearing families apart. And while Marc was in prison, and I was speaking and I was being an activist, being in the media, campaigning in Washington State, helping make it legal in whatever ways we can, I was in the prison. I went down every other weekend to visit Marc in Mississippi in a federal prison, and it broke my heart to see the families torn apart. These little children, their fathers, their families, the parents visiting. There is no price tag on that kind of human suffering, the lost potential, the destruction of families where mothers become single mothers trying to support their children and their husband in prison, and that is not an easy task, and I am very fortunate. I was so lucky to have such an easy time of it, having a recognized husband, a movement behind us, supporters from all angles, and to know that we are right and we are winning and that the war on marijuana will end. But it's not over yet. So while you're here talking to venture capitalists and you're reading the newspapers about millions of dollars of money and all this great stuff, just please remember that people are still being arrested today, right now, going to prison. Families are still being torn apart. There is a human cost of keeping marijuana illegal. There's a civil liberties violation going on every single day. And while we move forward to the great potential and the jobs and everything wonderful of legalization, we must remember that there were lives lost and a massive price paid, and that until no one ever goes to prison again for pot, we are not done this job. No one should ever go to prison for a peaceful activity, but my husband did. He changed the world in major ways, and I'm so proud to welcome him home, the Prince of Pot, Marc Emery, my husband.
It's nice stuff to be thought of as a leader of a liberation movement. Civil disobedience for me was a matter of breaking the law openly, transparently. In fact, I bought advertisements, usually in the daily paper of whatever city I was going to or where I was doing this. And I would tell them, I'm going to break this law. It's a bad law. It should be broken. It should be broken publicly. I'm breaking it. I want to be arrested so I can go before a judge and explain that it's a bad law. Well, most times I lost that argument with the judge, and they said, well, that is the law, though. And so I've been arrested before my latest 5-year sentence that I just recently completed in the United States, I was arrested 28 times for marijuana violations, some very obscure ones too, like promoting vaporizers and strange laws I didn't even know existed. And I was jailed 23 times, and that was in Canada for my civil disobedience. In the United States, and I'm going to focus on that, what it's like being in a U.S. prison system. I went to 6 different prisons in the United States, and before I proceed further, I want to give a long-delayed Valentine to my wife, Jodie, because candidly, even though I went to jail and I was proud of doing it and I had good reasons for doing it, the fact is it's very draining on everybody around you. And consequently, in order to keep me just reasonably comfortable in prison, it's extremely expensive, and I drained every dime out of every cent she earned. I don't know if that's possible, a dime every cent, but I took up every bit of money that was possible in order to stay alive in prison. And I basically made her life very difficult. I damaged our businesses by sucking up so much money. Just to give you an example, in a U.S. prison system, they have email, which is a wonderful thing, and I was able to write notes to her. Not internet, by the way, just email. Standard basic AOL 1995 email. And at 1995 prices, it was $3 an hour. But just to let you know, in just under 5 years, it cost $18,000 of Jodie's money, because I had none, just to get emails from me over that 4.5 years. It cost $15,000 so I could call her for 10 minutes a day over 4.5 years. My food bills ran into the tens of thousands of dollars, and you can only spend $320 a month on food, but over 5 years, that's $15,000. But the most important thing she did, and it's my weakness that I wanted it, that I was so needy, is she came to visit me 81 times while I was in prison. And I was far, far away. I was 2,000 miles, 3,500 kilometers most of the time, either in southeast Georgia near Jacksonville at the other end of the continent, or in Mississippi for 3 years, which is pretty far away. She visited me 81 times. That was 164 days. She'd sit beside me for 6 hours, and we'd try and surreptitiously hold hands, because oftentimes that was even prohibited, and there was no other physical contact that's allowed or possible. But she spent 164 days sitting beside me in that 5 years, and that's 5.5 years of her life. But not only that, it took a whole day to travel to see me, 13 to 14 hours, and it took 13 to 14 hours to come home on. So she spent also 165 days traveling to see me in that time, another 5.5 months of her life. So a total of 11 months of her life from beginning to end, that morning to that night, was spent either visiting me, traveling to visit me, or actually visiting me. So, Jodie, I've never really said thank you. I really haven't. It's terrible that 10 months has gone by and I've never publicly thanked you. But without your business and without your acumen and without your dedication and without your tireless devotion, I would not have made it.
I wouldn't have made it either.
Now, that having been said, it's a very expensive proposition to go to prison, and I didn't live in any luxury in any way whatsoever. But I'll tell you some things that are true and aren't true about the U.S. prison system. First of all, and also I want to point out that almost all our old enemies, every last one of them now, are on our side. The mayor who swore and he would drive me out of town and have me arrested, he did have me arrested 4 times, is now an advocate for legalization. The drug squad Kashid in Vancouver, who was head of the drug squad, who busted me, is now working for medical marijuana corporations. The premier of the province of British Columbia, Mike Harcourt, who was premier when I was first arrested, is now working also for a medical marijuana corporation. The prosecutor who indicted me, John McKay, the district attorney of Western Washington, later decided that was the wrong thing to do, prohibition, and he decided to write the law that legalized marijuana in Washington state, and did press conferences with Jodie together while I was in prison, advocating legalization in both Washington state and British Columbia. So we're clearly winning, and it's one of the reasons I have no bitter or negative feelings about any of my prison time. By the way, I had many epiphanies when I was in Canadian prisons too. I've been arrested and jailed in almost every province, and certainly 18 or so cities including almost everyone that we can name that's a major city in Canada. I've been arrested for marijuana in that city, deliberately smoking a bong in front of a police station oftentimes. But I spent 3 months in Saskatoon Correctional, which is their prison there, just for passing one joint, of which nobody ever saw. It's only someone said I passed a joint. And you can get 3 months for that in Canada, only in 2004. I like to think that in a lot of ways, IdeaCity has been very instrumental in my law breaking. After I spoke here in 2003, at a spur-of-the-moment thing, I said, I'm going to go across Canada, I'm going to smoke a bong in front of police stations, I'm going to point out that this law is wrong, unjust, immoral, and I went right out the next day. Moses said, don't do it while IdeaCity is on, please wait till Saturday. And I went and smoked out in front of the Toronto police station here. I did not get arrested, but then subsequently I got arrested in Winnipeg and Saskatoon, Regina, and many cities across Canada to try and make my point, which has finally surfaced now in an intellectual wave going all across the planet, that we should legalize marijuana, reconsider the drug war, reconsider the terrible harms the drug war has done. In prison, by the way, first thing was people were saying, oh, gee, I hope you don't get raped. Rape does not really exist in the federal prison system that I saw. I was there 4.5 years in 6 different kinds of prison, every different kinds of prison, immigrant prison, private prisons, maximum security detention centers, massive warehouses that just hold people until they can find some place for you, and then finally a federal bureau of prison in Mississippi. And actually, sexual predation, in my experience, doesn't exist in federal prisons, so that's good news. They've solved that. And in a lot of ways, prisons are rationally run. I began to see the point of view of the prisoners as well as the prison officials. I had a lot of opportunity to talk with them, and I came along and I was sympathetic to everything in a way except the long, outrageous sentences that people in the United States get for drugs. And almost every kind of crime, they send people away for a long, long time in the United States, and it's an example we should never emulate. That having been said, I kind of miss a lot of it. Because, I'm struggling out here now. I drained all the money from Jodie. I'm paying the consequences of my action. It's a struggle to survive economically. The government garnishes all my money. They seize anything that goes into a bank account. Because of what I did in 2001, which was I financed 79 candidates in British Columbia for our fabulous election campaign, the BC Marijuana Party campaign, and in order to give $160,000 that came from my seed business, I raised $5 million and gave it all away. That's one of the things about being transparent when you're breaking the law. You can't appear to benefit by it personally. So all that money had to be given away, and it went away for good purposes. One of the things I did all over the world was finance political parties in Israel, in Poland. Anywhere somebody was advocating legalization, I tried to finance that. We bought full-page ads in New Zealand in 1999 to advocate they vote for the Marijuana Party of New Zealand. I was amazed I could do this. Eventually, I started financing ballot initiatives in the United States, in Washington, D.C., in Colorado, in Arizona, in Alaska, and giving millions of dollars to these things and seeing them come to fabulous fruition. And ultimately, when I was arrested in 2005, the DEA did not cite my crime, which was merely selling seeds. They did say I was one of the top 50 most wanted in the world, that the Attorney General called me the 46th most dangerous man on the planet. And they identified that I gave money to all these legalization groups, hundreds of thousands of dollars. I had a propagandist magazine, which to this day always amazes me that the powerful U.S. government would say my little magazine, Cannabis Culture, was a propagandist magazine. And they went on and on about this. So I knew I was on the right track, and I knew I was going to go to jail. And I even predicted that in 2001 when I was here. I said, one day they're going to come and get me because I'm getting too successful at this. This is going to change the world, and I'm confident it's going to change the world, and there's a price to pay for that. And indeed, I have paid that price, but it turned out to be different than what I thought. I never heard really an unkind word said to me in 4.5 years in prison. It's quite shocking, but I went to these 6 different prisons, and I found myself very useful, very in demand. When I was at an immigrant prison, we had 2,500 inmates crammed into one place, and it was a very small place, and they were almost all from Mexico and Latin America. Many of them didn't even speak English. And yet, there are no lawyers in a prison. You have to come up with your own legal defenses and your own work. And so I became the jailhouse lawyer. I had lineups every day of people wanting me to do their divorce papers, their child custody papers, their grievances. I would be filling them out. Someone who both understood English and also could compose in English their grievances, their requests, their legal things. And I did that until it became very effective, and I started getting people fired in that prison. prison, and then they put me on trash detail because they can order you around in a prison to do what they want, really. And I was obviously getting too successful helping all these inmates, so they put me in a place where I could not be successful helping them. But I drew enough attention to that particular prison. I had a member of our legislature from British Columbia come and visit me and listen to all the things I thought were wrong. First of all, I thought it was wrong that Canadians get sent to private prisons, immigrant prisons in the United States when they're sentenced. They don't go to where Americans go. They go to a far cut-rate, bad prison run by private companies like Geo Group or Corrections Corporation of America. And they languish in there, generally, Canadians. And they're one of there were 15 Canadians, and then there were 150 Caribbeans, and then there were 2,500 people from all the cartels in Latin America. And all the members of prisons who are from Mexico and Latin America tend to be a member of a cartel or a kind of group. Now, in fairness, so do all the Americans, because one of the things that stopped sexual predation in prisons was that when you arrive there, and you're, say, a white person from Nevada or a black person from Florida, is that every other black person from Florida comes up and says, "We're here for you," which is a smart thing. So if anything happens to you, it happens to us, and therefore we will come to your aid, and they sure will. If one person from the Florida blacks are in a fight, all of them are ready. And same with the Mexicans, same with all the other Hispanics. So what that guarantees is mutually assured destruction if anybody loses their head, because that means the prison will immediately go into lockdown. All racial events are looked at very seriously in prison, and people will be frozen into their cells. So I've generally found that prisoners immediately said, listen, we can cope okay with each other. Let's just keep a cool head. We won't get locked down. We won't get solitary. We won't get punished. Things will be as good as we can get. And I found that was really, really a sane method of keeping order in the prison, because the prisoners always run the prison ultimately. So there was no sexual predation, because if someone arrived who would be young and vulnerable, he automatically has friends who will go to the wall for him. So no one is going to prey on him. And so that is largely eliminated, and that's a very good thing, because I heard about this for years. I heard some distasteful jokes, too, about don't bend over to get the soap in the shower and stuff like that. And I was so relieved to see that that never, ever happened insofar as I ever saw it. Other things that are true is that I got 7,500 letters sent to me when I was in prison from individuals. One man, a man who never met me, he wrote me first when I first got in, he says, "I've decided to make you my human rights project. I'm going to write you every day until you get out of prison." And indeed he did. For 4.5 years, Len Preslesnik wrote me a letter, and not just a letter of what was going on in his hometown of Holland, Michigan, which is what I always told people to tell me. I said, don't ask how I'm doing. Don't tell me about your life. I just want to read about your life. Because I would get letters that say, oh, it must be horrible in there. It must be terrible in there. And I would have to write back patiently. I wrote 2,000 people eventually out of the 7,500. It would take me about 90 minutes to 2 hours a day to write them an 8 or 9 page letter. I thought I couldn't just write them a thank you. It seemed insincere. So I'd write them these big, long letters to everybody, which a lot of people regard as collectible, and that's so nice. But one of the things I said to people is, it's not horrible in here. I'm very busy. I'm very active. I'm busy helping lots of people. You would be pleased with what I'm doing, and I'm not suffering. So please don't think that. I have to say that almost every letter. Because people say, I can only imagine how terrible it is. And I said, please don't imagine how terrible it is. Please think of me like you always thought of me, working hard, doing what I want to do. And I'll tell you, I read a book every 10 days. I learned to play bass guitar. I'm telling you, prison is filled with fabulous musicians. Unfortunately, many of them have alcohol or methamphetamine problems. So they end up in prison for long times, and they're outstanding. And they took a liking to me because I like musicians. I'd never picked up an instrument in my life, and they taught me how to play bass guitar. They invited me into their rock and roll band, which was ridiculous because they all had 15 to 30 years experience. But I ended up playing 14 concerts over a 3-year period. I learned 170 songs, including Otis Redding, Bob Marley, country songs. I even sang a country song called Way Out Here, which is as redneck a song as you get. I absolutely have no experience with this kind of sentiment, but I love these songs. And I had a wonderful time as a musician. And I had a New York Times subscription, which I read and devoured every day. I had stacks, David would appreciate this, stacks of New York Times Sunday crosswords, which I delighted in doing. I had quality thinking time. I wrote a blog every week. Just to let you know, I haven't read a book since I got out of prison. I haven't read a magazine. I haven't played a guitar. Somebody gave me a brand new Fender Precision bass. I've touched it for 2 hours in 10 months. I haven't written a blog. I haven't done any of those things I love to do in prison. I had quality thinking time in prison. So I know prison is a bad place for most people, but for me, I had lots of epiphanies there. And I learned a lot about this. One of the things I'll tell you I learned at Saskatoon Correctional. and I know they were short. One of the many things, I thought it would last so much longer. One of the things I learned is you've got to learn to see both sides of every question sometimes. And one day, a fellow came back to Saskatchewan. I said, where have you been? He said, I just saw my father at the morgue. And I said, really? He said, yeah, well, his funeral's up in Larange, which is 8 miles. By the way, when I was in Saskatoon Correctional, everyone else was Native. I was pretty well the only white person in that prison. And so he said, they're not going to pay for me to go see his funeral, so I saw him at the morgue. I said, really? And I said, how was that? He says, well, I never knew my father well, but it was uncomfortable because I was all in chains. And one thing I will tell you is everywhere you move in the U.S. prison, you're in chains. I was constantly chained around my belly, through my hands, and then leg irons, which do hurt when you walk because they're tight, and anything you go up and down steps. Anyway, this fellow said, I felt uncomfortable, but he said that's the way they do it. I said, man, that is so unjust, going to see your father at the morgue and you're all chained up. I said, that's ridiculous. I said, who'd run away from a situation like that? And there was this long pause. He said, well, up to 3 months ago, that was true. But then they took a guy to his father's funeral and he ran away. And I said, really, you're kidding? He says, yeah, so ever since then, we've been chained up when something like that. And then I went to the director of the prison and I said, how do you get these rules, some of which seemed to me absurd? And he says, Marc, this prison opened in 1976 and we had no rules. And for every situation that occurred where we didn't have a rule, we had to develop a rule. So all the rules you see that sometimes exasperate you arose because there was a requirement for a rule in order to keep the safety of this place. And I found that was generally true. So many absurd rules. Another thing I want to say before I go is taxpayers don't pay anything for the prisons in the area. They pay for the building, the staff, and the really bad food that you have to eat. And inmates pay for everything else. When I was at anywhere in the United States, but certainly in Mississippi, Yazoo, we paid for the televisions, we paid for the cable, we paid for the basketballs, the pool tables, we paid for my guitar, we paid for everything. Whenever we shopped at the commissary, the U.S. government doesn't permit prisons to make money off prisoners, but the money that is made in profits goes to pay for everything the prisoners use. So taxpayers don't pay. So if you ever hear that, oh, they're playing pool all day or they're watching television or doing these things, you don't pay for any of it. The taxpayer doesn't pay for any of it. The inmates pay for everything. And like I say, everybody was very kind and helpful to me, really respectful. If people wanted to make an introduction to me, someone would introduce them and come up to me. I was always given my space. Whenever I walked around the track, I would be reading a book, which I constantly tried to get the others to do, because all these young men and middle-aged men were working out to look great, and I told them, looking great won't help you on the outside. Please read these books. And in fact, people responded to the call. When I was at the immigrant prison, there were no books in that place. I told people there were no books, so somebody went on the internet and sent over 1,000 books to me to give out to all the other prisoners. And they bought them from anywhere from 1 cent to $5 each. But people would do some amazing, great things to help us out in there. It's 1,000 books. Eventually, the prison stopped it because they said, like, there's books everywhere. Who knows what you're doing here? You could be running some big thing and charging people for money.
Marc has neglected to mention that he also helped out a lot of people in other situations. There was someone whose father was brutally murdered, and he couldn't go to the funeral, and I sent flowers for him because that's all that he could do. There were a lot of suffering, a lot of stories, and I know, Moses, we have so much to get through, but I want to mention that Marc is incredibly optimistic. He's done so much for the world, but prison is cruel. Prison is cruel. Solitary confinement, locked in a box the size of that bathroom for 23 hours a day is no way to treat a human being. So please, when you think of prison, please think that if anyone has done harm to others, harming them in return is no solution.
Well, I'm proud to know these two, and I'm proud of the fact that a tiny little contribution that we made at IdeaCity was years ago endorsing Marc's work and keeping his story alive until we see him now free. Thank you.
There are 5 documentaries about me, and one by Albert Nuremberg, who's right here, a wonderful movie called Escape to Canada. So if you want to find out what became of all that, these movies cover a lot of it. Thanks.
Get together, boys.
One more.